When you look at a primate on television, in a movie, or in a vintage circus photograph, you will often see them smiling. A wide, toothy grin that looks remarkably human. We see that expression, and we project our own joy onto them. We assume they are happy. We assume they are playing. We assume they are willing participants in our entertainment and our scientific endeavors. But in the intricate, silent language of primates, a wide smile with bared teeth has absolutely nothing to do with happiness. In the world of chimpanzees and macaques, this expression is known as a fear grimace. It is the biological manifestation of absolute, paralyzing terror. It is the face an animal makes when it is completely overwhelmed by panic, expecting to be severely hurt and begging for mercy from a vastly superior predator. For over a century, humanity has looked at the terrified, screaming faces of our closest biological relatives and completely misread them as joy. And behind that tragic misunderstanding lies one of the darkest, most profoundly disturbing chapters in the history of human science. Chimpanzees and macaque monkeys share an astonishing amount of DNA with human beings. They are not just intelligent, they are deeply, fundamentally emotional. In the wild, they form complex political alliances. They mourn their dead, and their infants share a bond with their mothers that is virtually identical to a human child's need for maternal love. A baby monkey requires physical warmth, rocking, eye contact, and endless affection to develop a normal mind. But this beautiful biological similarity became their ultimate curse. Because they are so much like us, the scientific community decided they were the perfect subjects to endure the psychological and physical horrors that were considered far too cruel to inflict upon human beings. In the 1950s, an American psychologist named Harry Harlow set out to study the exact nature of love. He wanted to scientifically prove that a mother's affection was necessary for child development. And to prove how important love was, he decided to systematically, surgically destroy it. Deep inside a sterile, fluorescent-lit laboratory at the University of Wisconsin, Harlow began to rip newborn rhesus macaque infants away from their screaming mothers within hours of their birth. These terrified, blind, desperate babies were placed into cold, isolated steel cages. To study their trauma, Harlow built what he called surrogate mothers. One was a cold, harsh cylinder made entirely of bare wire that dispensed milk from a bottle. The other was a similar cylinder, but wrapped in soft terry cloth, which provided no food at all. The results were instantly heartbreaking. The starving infant monkeys would only go to the freezing wire mother for the few seconds it took to drink the milk. But they would spend all of their remaining time clinging desperately to the cloth mother. They would hug the lifeless piece of fabric, burying their terrified faces into it, rocking back and forth for hours, begging the inanimate object to hold them back. When Harlow introduced loud noises or terrifying mechanical toys into the cage, the babies wouldn't run away. They would sprint directly to the cloth mother, clinging to it in sheer panic, performing that wide, toothy fear grimace, desperately seeking a protector that could not comfort them. But Harlow was not satisfied with just taking away their real mothers. He wanted to see if the babies would eventually hate a mother that abused them. So he built a new series of surrogates he literally called the monster mothers. One cloth mother was designed to occasionally blast the clinging infant with freezing cold compressed air, throwing the baby against the steel cage. Another surrogate was equipped with hidden brass spikes that would violently stab outward, piercing the infant's skin when it tried to hug the cloth. A third was violently shaken by a mechanical catapult, violently rejecting the baby. But the most horrifying discovery was not the cruelty of the machines. It was the reaction of the babies. No matter how violently they were abused, no matter how many times they were stabbed, frozen, or thrown across the cage, the infants never stopped loving the monster mothers. As soon as the spikes retracted or the shaking stopped, the bleeding, weeping babies would crawl right back and hug the terrifying machines even tighter, crying in the dark. They had absolutely nothing else in the world to love. They were biologically programmed to need a mother so desperately they would accept endless torture just to touch a piece of cloth. As the years went on, the experiments grew even darker. Harlow wanted to study the anatomy of severe clinical depression. To do this, he invented a device that is still infamous in the halls of psychology. He called it the Pit of Despair. It was a tiny, vertical stainless steel chamber shaped like an inverted pyramid. There were no windows, there was no sound, just smooth, cold, slippery steel sloping down to a dark grate at the bottom. Healthy, socially active young monkeys were dropped into this pitch-black sensory deprivation chamber and left there. Not for hours, not for days, but for weeks, months, and sometimes up to an entire year. Inside the Pit of Despair, the minds of these highly intelligent social creatures simply shattered. Within a few days, they stopped moving entirely. They retreated into the darkest bottom corner of the steel pyramid, curling into tight little balls, wrapping their arms around themselves and staring blankly into the darkness. When they were finally pulled out of the chamber months later, they were completely, irreparably insane. They didn't play, they didn't fight. When other monkeys tried to interact with them, they simply froze in terror, exhibiting the wide-eyed fear grimace, their minds permanently broken by the absolute, crushing weight of total isolation. Harlow had successfully manufactured madness. But the cruelty of the laboratories was not isolated to the basements of universities. In 1961, the United States was desperate to win the space race against the Soviet Union. Before they could risk sending a human being into the lethal vacuum of space, they needed a test subject. They chose a 3-year-old chimpanzee named Ham. Ham was taken from the wild in French Cameroon, his mother likely shot dead in front of him. He was shipped to the Holloman Aerospace Medical Center, where he was strapped into specialized chairs to learn how to operate the controls of a spacecraft. His training was brutally simple. If he pulled the correct lever when a blue light flashed, he received a banana pellet. If he pulled the wrong lever, or if he reacted too slowly, he was subjected to a painful electric shock directly to the soles of his feet. Ham learned to operate the levers not out of a desire to explore the stars, but out of the sheer, desperate need to avoid the electric pain shooting through his body. On January 31st, 1961, Ham was strapped into a tiny, claustrophobic capsule and launched into space on top of a massive Mercury Redstone rocket. The launch was chaotic. The rocket flew far higher and faster than intended, subjecting the terrified chimpanzee to extreme gravitational forces. Inside the tiny capsule, deafened by the roar of the engines, tumbling through zero gravity, Ham was completely alone. But despite his overwhelming terror, his conditioning took over. As the blue lights flashed in the darkness of the capsule, Ham diligently pulled the levers, avoiding the imaginary electric shocks while hurtling through the vacuum of space. When Ham's capsule finally crashed back down into the Atlantic Ocean, rescue crews pried open the hatch. The cameras of the world were waiting. The resulting photographs were plastered across newspapers around the globe. They showed Ham being unstrapped from his seat, looking directly at the camera with a massive, wide, toothy grin. The public saw the picture and celebrated. They thought the brave little astronaut was smiling, happy to be home, proud of his incredible achievement. But the primatologists who saw the photograph felt their blood run cold. They knew exactly what that expression was. Ham was not smiling. He was displaying the ultimate fear grimace. He was a captive animal who had just survived the most terrifying, deafening, traumatic experience of his life, surrounded by loud humans and flashing cameras, completely paralyzed by fear, begging not to be hurt anymore. Ham survived his trip to space, but he was never returned to the wild. He lived the rest of his life inside zoo enclosures, a forgotten hero of the space age. The legacy of primate testing is a heavy, uncomfortable shadow over the history of human progress. We used their astonishing biological similarities to save our own lives. We used their capacity for deep emotional attachment to study our own minds. We took creatures capable of profound love, complex grief, and intense terror, and we locked them in steel boxes. The next time you see a vintage photograph of a chimpanzee in a laboratory or a circus, look closely at their face. Look past the illusion of the human smile, because underneath those bared teeth is a silent, desperate scream from a cousin we betrayed.